Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. My name is Kim Ricketts, and I manage, along with Kirsten Wiley, the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. Today, we welcome physicist Mlodinow to Microsoft Research, here to discuss how randomness rules our lives. And of course, for most of us, this is not a comforting thought. In fact, we spend much of our time here collecting huge amounts of data and information and finding and creating patterns and codes to predict and to plan and to solve problems. Randomness is not in our plan. And the human mind, in fact, is built to assign a cause to each event and to concoct a story of meaning around unrelated events. But today we begin the unsettling process of looking at the role of chance in our daily lives. And our guide through that journey is Dr. Mlodinow, who is currently a lecturer in physics at Caltech and has published extensively in that field. He has also published works of popular science, including Feynman's Rainbow, Euclid's Window, and with Stephen Hawking, A Briefer History of Time. He has also written screenplays for films and television, including work on Star Trek, The Next Generation, and MacGyver, and has co-authored a series on children's books entitled The Kids of Einstein Elementary. We're thrilled to welcome Dr. Leonard Mlodinow to Microsoft Research.
Thank you. Before my talk, we gave everybody 2 questions, and we divide you into 2 groups. And so in a little bit, I'll call for the answers, and hopefully I'll get the average value of the answer to the second question from each group, and we'll compare those. But the name of the book is The Drunkard's Walk. It's not a self-help book for alcoholics. It's about randomness. And in particular, it's about the importance of randomness in our lives and how we often underestimate how important chance events are in our lives, whether it be in business, sports, medicine, our love life. And all these things, we're constantly affected by unforeseen or unpredictable random events that change our paths in life. And we often misinterpret what happens, not understanding what the role of randomness was, or we make wrong inferences because we didn't understand the role of randomness. So I wrote this book to talk about the theory of randomness and the historical development of the concept, but also mainly to talk about its effect on our lives and also the psychological phenomena that make it hard for us to understand what's really going on. The term Drunkard's Walk, a lot of you probably know, if not all of you, is a mathematical process that essentially is a process of random meanderings. And I named the book Drunkard's Walk because I think that the process of random meanderings is a good metaphor for our process of life. We might think we have a direction, and we might make plans, and we may work very hard at what we're at, but things are constantly hitting us from different directions, and it's those things and our reactions to them that determine our path in life. The talk is divided into 2 sections. The first part, I'm going to talk about some illusions and confusions that arise from randomness, some surprising situations that we may misinterpret. And the second part of the talk, I'm going to talk about some of the psychological effects that cause us to do that. So the first illusion that I want to talk about, I call the illusion of causality. You'll see the Drunkard's Walk here again in the lower left. And I have the laser pointer, but the old-fashioned low-tech one will work. The start is here, and it meanders, and it finishes up there. Now, if you weren't privy to the actual path that you can see here, and you just saw that somebody started at the lower left and ended at the upper right, you might think that the person got there on purpose. But actually, as you all know, when you execute a drunkard's walk or a random walk, you actually get somewhere even though you're not aiming to get anywhere. And that is what happens a lot in life. Here I have 3 examples. The top one is from sports. We all tend to think that when there's a championship sports series, the best team wins, unless there's some extraordinary event of luck that happens in the series, like if it's the Chicago Cubs, some guy reaching over and grabbing a ball out of the fielder's hand, you normally don't talk about the luck of winning or losing the games. You think that the winner of the series deserved it and that the series proves which team is best. In high schools, in colleges, people look at various statistics and data and they infer from them what they think the schools are like. Now, if you have kids who go to these high schools or colleges, you might know that that may be not a very good picture, but people tend to believe that. And in the lower right, I have an example from business. This has to do with a fellow named Bill Miller. Bill Miller was the head of a fund called the Legg Mason Mutual Fund, and he got a lot of press because his mutual fund beat the Standard & Poor's Index for 15 years in a row. This was hailed as various things, my favorite of which is the greatest fund feat in the past 40 years. And people quoted in a lot of different articles about Bill Miller the various odds of someone accomplishing that. They ranged from about 150,000 to 1 in the 13th year to saw somewhere 4 billion to 1, which would be hard to believe actually that a 4 billion to 1 occurrence actually occurs given the number of mutual fund managers there are. But let's look at this and see what the chances really were. So my point here is that when you look at something that happens that seems very rare or extraordinary, and you're wondering what the chances were of that happening at random or whether you should have expected that that might have happened purely by chance, you have to be very careful in how you do your analysis. A lot of times it's hard to separate the causal component of something from the random component. And one way to approach this is to say, would we expect this to happen if things were purely random? And if we don't expect this to happen if things were purely random, then we might say, wow, the odds against us were very great and this guy really accomplished something. But let's see if it really was 4 billion to 1 or what it was for Bill Miller or for someone like him. So let's assume that the chances of beating the Standard & Poor's in any given year are 1 in 2. Okay? Then the probability of Bill Miller beating the Standard & Poor's for 15 years in a row would be 1 over 2 to the 15th, which is about 32,000. So that is indeed a pretty long odds against him. But as the graphic says, that's the probability of Bill Miller beating it 15 years in a row, starting in 1991, right? So you have to be very careful when you're dealing with random situations before you give the answers to make sure you're asking the right questions. And is the question here, what are the chances that Bill Miller beat the Standard & Poor's 15 years in a row, starting in 1991? Well, if you thought that Bill Miller was an idiot and totally incompetent, and it was 1991, you might say, hey, let's do a test and see what the chances are of him beating the Standard & Poor's for the next 15 years. They're probably pretty small. But nobody was really saying that. Really what was happening was people are observing the market and the mutual funds, and they're looking for outstanding events. And when they notice that somebody beat the market or beat the Standard & Poor's for 15 years in a row, then they say, hey, that guy, he did something great. So there's no real reason to say what are the chances that Bill Miller beat the market 15 years in a row. It could have been anybody. It could have been Barry Diller if he were a stockbroker. And if it were Barry Diller instead of Bill Miller, we'd have exactly the same headlines that we had talking about Barry Diller as being the king of the stock market. So what you really have to do is recalculate this, taking into account the fact there are thousands of mutual fund managers trying to beat the market. Actually, there's about 5,000 or 6,000, but the articles that I was looking at tended to use the number 1,000. They were talking about comparable funds, so that's okay. We'll use 1,000, which makes the odds not quite as great. The odds that someone amongst 1,000 managers beating the market for 15 years in a row, starting in 1991, are about 3%. So in a series of parallel universes, if you had exactly the same thing happen, about 3 out of every 100 of those universes, somebody would do the Bill Miller feat. It might not be Bill Miller, but it would be somebody. Now, here's the other thing, because I notice I keep saying starting in 1991. Now, is that special? If he had started in 1990, would people have been less impressed? They say, hey, he didn't do it in 91, he did it starting in 90. No, they just say 15 years in a row, right? So the question is, why should we look at one 15-year period? There's no reason to do that. We should look at many 15-year periods or a longer period of time. I took 40 years because the article talked about this being a great feat over the last 40 years. That's not as great a time period as it sounds, because if you compare it to 15, you can't even fit 3 of those 15s in there, at least non-overlapping. So I said, what are the chances that somebody amongst just 1,000 people trying this every year with a 50% chance would do it in some time in the last 40 years? It's about 3 in 4. So I would claim that the chances of Bill Miller's feat were not 1 in 4 billion, but about 75%. And if I didn't see someone doing it, I would say, why? We're really wasting our money on these mutual funds, because you could be flipping a coin and do it. And a lot of people say that's true, and you should buy index funds. So the moral of this story is that the headline should have said, expected 15-year run finally occurs, Bill Miller, lucky beneficiary. Okay, the second illusion I wanted to talk about, I call it the illusion of small numbers. It has another name. It's called the law of small numbers. It was given to it by these two guys, two psychologists named Kahneman and Tversky that I'm going to talk about a little later. I don't like the law of small numbers because when I talk to people about the law of small numbers, they think it's true. But the law of small numbers is our sarcastic name for people applying the law of large numbers to small numbers. I know I don't have to tell anybody here about that, but people tend to think the law of large numbers says that the underlying probabilities or potentials of things will tend to be reflected in the results if you repeat the test often enough, right? It doesn't apply if you repeat the test twice, okay? And this is something that confuses many people. It doesn't necessarily confuse people on the conscious level. It confuses you on the intuitive level. And that's why it causes problems, even for people who know all about probability theory. So one example I like to use here is you look at CEOs, and let's assume that each one has a certain probability of success in any given year. However you define success, it doesn't really matter. Every industry or company could have a different definition, but suppose that you believe in the CEO to this extent, or the past history shows that you have some reason to believe that this person will have a 60% chance of having success in any given year. Things could still happen. Oil prices could go up. That's unlikely. The weather could get warmer. That'll never happen. I mean, a lot of strange things could happen to get in the way. Small things. Vendors maybe not coming through. I know at Microsoft you never find that. So these things could happen, but in the end, if you fold it all in, let's assume he has a 60%, or she has a 60% probability. So the question is, okay, fine, that's the underlying probability. Now we're looking, we don't get to see that, right? We might estimate that, but we don't get to see that in life. What we get to see are the results. What we look at are, how do they do over the last 5 years? How do they do over the last 10 years, right? So the question is, in a given 5-year period, what are the chances now that when we look at the results that those are going to reflect the underlying probability of success? So what are the chances, for instance, in 5 years that the CEO who has a 60% chance a priori of success will have 3 out of 5 good years, which is 60%. If that happens, we go, look, he had 60% good years. That must mean that he or she had a 60% potential. You tend to think that way, right? Well, here's the graph. So here's a histogram showing from 0 to 5, what are the chances of having that many good years out of 5? The chances of having precisely 3 out of 5 good years are only 1 in 3. So 2/3 of the time, the person's results will not reflect their ability or their potential. And in fact, in 1 out of 10 cases, you can expect someone with a 60% probability of success to have either 5 good years in a row or all 5 bad years in a row. Which means if you look at the Fortune 500, about 50 of those companies, even if the CEO had a 60% or the company had a 60% chance of success, 50 of those companies would have either 5 good or 5 bad years despite that. So the question is, I was talking about the law of large numbers and the law of small numbers, or the illusion of small numbers. How large is large, okay? Well, now I'm going to briefly transfer to championship sports series because you don't usually get even 7 years as a CEO to try and prove that you're not really a loser, even if your company isn't doing well. But you could have a 7-game sports series and lose the first couple and you're still in the game. So suppose in a sports series we tend to have these 7-game series for championships, and suppose that the two teams are matched with a 55-45 edge. One team has a 55 either historical chance or theoretical chance of beating the other team in any given day. I think this is actually a pretty lopsided edge. In professional sports, by the time you get to the World Series or the NBA playoffs, the teams are pretty evenly matched, and 55-45 is not a real even match. But let's just say that that's what the probabilities are, and you play a best of X series. All right, we play best of 7 series. What do you think the chances are that the inferior team is going to win? In other words, win 4 out of 7. It's about 40%. So playing a best of 7 series doesn't really tell you a lot. Now, it's fun. I don't deny that. I don't want no one say that I don't like sports. I mean, I think it's exciting, it's fun, but it's not very meaningful, okay? Now, let's get meaningful. Let's see, there's a little trade-off. How much fun would it be if it were meaningful? Well, let's say we want it to be this meaningful. We only want the lesser team to win 1 out of 4 times, okay? How many games do you have to play? All right. Well, it's a little bit more than 7. What do you think? 10, 15, 20? 45. Well, I don't know. ABC or NBC might not want to keep televising by the 39th game of the same 2 teams going against each other. So that's quite a bit. And being into mathematics, I asked one other question, which is, this is already getting a little bit on the tedious side. But let's say we really want to know who's better, okay? We really want to know who's better. So let's say we want a statistically significant result, which means that the inferior team will win only about 5% of the time. 95% of the time, the better team will win. How many games then? You need 269 games, which is several NBA seasons, 1.5 baseball seasons of the same team playing each other head-on to be statistically significant. So the point here is in sports we don't really care that much, but when we observe people's results in other areas, we do tend to draw conclusions from much smaller numbers than we really have a right to. Okay, the last mathematical illusion I want to talk about, I'm calling here conditional confusion. This comes up a lot in the medical field. This has happened to me personally, and you probably all know someone who has suffered from this effect. This has to do with false positives on medical exams. Suppose that the probability of a false positive, which means that the test comes out positive, but there's really no tumor or no disease. Okay, in the case of a mammogram, it means that there's no tumor, and suppose that the probability is about 10% of that happening. The question is, if you have a positive test, what are the chances that the patient actually has a tumor? So I'm saying that the probability of a positive test when there's no tumor is 10%. Does that mean that the chances that you have a tumor, if they have a positive test, are 90%? Or are they 9%? Well, you probably know there's probably a trick here, but let's go on. First of all, you need more information. So if you know something about probability theory, you know you need more information. Okay, in this case, let's assume that there's about 1% incidence, women in their 40s, of breast cancer. That's roughly correct. And let's assume for simplicity that there are no false negatives, which means that you say you don't have it, but you do. It'll just make the next graphic a little bit simpler, but doesn't really change the point. Okay? Well, doctors were given this data in 2 different studies, and in one study, a third of the physicians chose A, 90%, and another study that was more open-ended, they guessed that the probability of cancer was about 75%. Okay, so when the false positive is a small number like 10%, people seem to think that a positive test is meaningful. Not at all, okay? Okay, now here's a correct but garbled English description of why that is, which I can't even understand even though I wrote it. The fraction of all those tested who tested positive but aren't is not the same as the fraction of all those who tested positive but aren't. Say that 10 times in a row, okay? Fortunately, I've learned sometimes that art is better than English, or math is better, but I chose artwork. Here's some artwork. Okay, here's 100 women. The N's are those who test negative and are negative. Remember, there's no false negatives. The F's are the 10%. There's 100 there. There's 10 F's, which represent the, there we go, I'm using the laser, there we go, high tech. So these are the false positives, 10%, right? So 10 out of 100. There's the true positive. Remember the incidence I said you have to know? 1 out of 100, okay? So before you start, you go 10 out of 100 false positive. They get a positive result even though they're not positive. small number, small fraction, that's it. Here's the one woman who actually has it, and here's the other. Now that you have the test, though, it's different. Forget these n's. They're irrelevant now. Now you know that you tested positive. You're only looking at these people. Okay, if you're looking at these people, what fraction of these people, these 11 people, have a false positive? What fraction are really positive? 1 out of 11 is really positive, right? The other 10 are those 10 false positives. So the answer is 9%. And the reason is that you have to compare the false positive rate to the actual incidence. That's what's important, not the raw false positive rate. And a lot of people don't understand that. So those are just a few examples of some of the randomness confusions. But now I want to talk about something else that I talk about quite a bit in the book, which is why, from the psychological point of view, we make these mistakes and what kinds of psychological errors occur in our thinking process and in our intuition that lead us to make these kinds of, have these false intuitions. Kahneman and Tversky were the pioneers, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, in much of this. Tversky died, unfortunately, in, I think it was 96. Kahneman got the, even though he's a psychologist, got the Nobel Prize in economics in 2002 for this work because it's so important in its implications for economics. And their work talked about what they called heuristics and biases, meaning that people's brains have evolved over millions of years in order to make quick judgments in dangerous situations of uncertainty and probability. And you don't have time to sit down and draw a diagram of the false positives and false negatives and figure out what's going on if a saber-toothed tiger is chasing you, right? Or if you see a blur and you don't know what it is, you have to make a decision based on your own feeling of probability. Now, if once in a while you're wrong and you run away from some leaves, that doesn't really hurt you very much, as long as you run away from the tigers, right? So the heuristics are the terms they use for these intuitions that we've developed, and the biases are the mistakes or our tendencies to make certain errors. And those errors are also called cognitive illusions in analogy to optical illusions. So I'm going to talk about 3 of those here. The book covers much more, but I don't have nearly enough time, and you would all fall over if I went over everything. So I'm going to give you 3 of these. The third one is the little test that we did before the talk began. So the first one is called the illusion of control. I really am fond of this one. There are many studies of this that are all extremely amusing and interesting. This one was a study of Yale students. So these are supposed to represent Yale students. And these coins represent coins. So what they did was they took the Yale students one at a time with an experimenter, and they said, I'm going to flip the coin a number of times, 30 times, and each flip you guess heads or tails. Okay, easy enough, simple. And certainly if you would ask the student, can you do that better than average, or better than at random, better than 50%, they would all say, oh no, it's all random. Unless they were a relative of Uri Geller. But that's if you ask them explicitly. But the question with all these is not whether you know this or whether you believe in it, but whether you feel it and how you behave, okay? So what they wanted to get into it a little bit deeper. So they brought these students in, they had them guess the coins, and as psychologists always do, if I would not be good in a psychological study because I always know they're lying to you, they're tricking you, and they're not really telling you what they're after, okay? And of course that's what they have to do. So in this case, they weren't really telling them whether they got the heads or tails right. They had a prearranged sequence that was identical for every student of yes, you got it, and oh, too bad you didn't get it. Prearranged, pre-designed, and occasionally they would show them the coin when the student guessed it right and was supposed to guess it right that time. They would say, look, you got it right. And otherwise, if they were supposed to guess it right and they were lying to them about guessing it right, but they really got it wrong, they just wouldn't show them the coin. So it looked pretty convincing to the students, but they all had identical experiences. They all got it right 15 out of 30 times. They all got it right more at the beginning and less at the end. So they got more of a feeling at the beginning that, hey, the first impression was this is going well. And then the question is, do they think it's going well, or do they still think that it's random, okay? So you don't really, again, now they don't know what they're being tested about, right? Because then they would figure out their answers consciously. And you don't ask them, can you guess, do you have ESP? They ask them slightly more disguised questions, and they ask them a bunch of questions, and then they look at the particular questions that they're interested in and see how they answer them. And in this case, they ask them these two slightly disguised questions. Would your performance be hampered by distraction? And would your performance improve with practice? Now, obviously, probably not, right? But what do they really feel? Well, they're just answering these questions, thinking, hopefully they're just how they feel about it. And surprisingly, a quarter of them thought they would be hampered by distraction, and 40% thought they would improve with practice. And this is not, as I say, an isolated case. There are many very amusing studies of this sort. And there are a lot of... I'm sorry? I don't know. But I do wonder sometimes about the randomness of the studies that are always done on college students. But anyway, the point is that people, there are other very serious studies actually about why people have this need to believe that they're in control. And there seem to be deep-seated psychological reasons that it would be hard to go on in life in some ways if you felt you didn't have control. And there were studies of nursing home patients who were given control over their environment versus nursing home patients who were not given control over what plants to have or taking care of their own rooms, etc. And the results were very dramatic, that the patients that were given control lived longer and did much better than the patients where everything was done for them and they had no decisions to make. Okay, the second bias, I'm going to talk about Bill Miller. Again, I'm just using him because I don't have much time to develop different examples. But by the way, he is supposedly, I haven't met him, a very bright and a nice person. And the only thing I'm talking about is that he's also a lucky person. And this bias is called the expectation bias, which is that our assessment of people, and one of the barriers to understanding what really happens, are our expectations. And when a fellow is this successful and the head of a big company making a lot of money, we tend to think they deserve it and that they have some skill that's bringing them the success that they're having. And so this has also been investigated in many arenas, and I think an amusing one is taste, in particular here, beverages, the beverage world. A lot has been done on wines. And of course, I enjoy a lot of wine, and I go to wine tastings, and I listen to a lot of banter about green pepper and wild strawberries and the scent of freshly tanned leather. And everyone goes, yes, I get that. Yeah, it's a Nike, I think. There are very fine distinctions made, and the question is, of course, would you make those distinctions if you didn't have certain expectations? And these studies are very amusing too, because, for instance, in a lineup, they did similar tricks to the coin tossing, where they line up wines for experts and don't really tell them what's going on. In this case, one of the wines was a white, and well, actually this is a few studies that are similar, but they put a white wine in that was dyed to look like either a rosé or a red. And they're analyzing the whole flight of wines and not knowing what they're being tested on, just giving their analysis. And sure enough, it's white wine, but it has tannin, and they assign the qualities of the red. They find the rosé, that's really a dry white, to be sweeter, and they basically taste the wine according to the way they expect the wine to taste. Now at Caltech recently there was this interesting study where this was not done with, there were many studies, by the way, done with wine experts, wine students. Okay, this particular study, though, which is fun, was done again with college students, so they're not wine experts. They're probably Boone's Farm experts, maybe, but if that's... So they lined up wines for them, and they labeled the price of the wines. Okay, but unbeknownst to them, two of the wines were identical, but one was labeled $90, and the other one, identical wine, was labeled $10. Okay, it's probably not a big surprise that they picked the $90 one as being better, right? And you could say, well, yeah, they don't want people to go, you can't even tell a $90 wine from a $10 one, of course, So there are that possibility that they really picked it better because they felt they should pick it better. But there's a little catch here. These people were doing this inside an MRI machine, okay? And their brain was being imaged. And they were actually not just ask them which one's better, they're looking to see, are their pleasure centers lighting up more? And guess what? They did. they actually were enjoying the $10 bottle labeled as 90 more than when it was labeled as 10. Okay? So that's how deep-seated these effects are. And the last study here is a Coke-Pepsi study where they got people together and said, hey, what's your, you like Coke, you like Pepsi? They found some who like Coke, some who like Pepsi, and then they said, let's just test it out. So they gave them some Coke and some Pepsi, and they said, try this, and what do you think? Well, 30% of the ones who said they liked either Coke or Pepsi changed their mind when they tested it, when they actually tasted it. 70% said, yeah, I was right, okay? But the trick here was there was Coke in the Pepsi bottle and there was Pepsi in the Coke bottle. So actually 70% were contradicting themselves when they actually tasted it. And the other 30% were the ones who actually were confirming their taste. So if you want someone, I always go to these fast food places with, or with your kids, and they order a Sprite and we only have 7-Up or 7-Up. They should just have the different cups. Just have one kind of beverage, put it in the Sprite cup, put it in the 7-Up cup, put it in the Coke cup, add a little dye. It can be just one beverage and just call it whatever you want and they'll like it. I don't know. I should patent that idea. Okay, now may I have the results? And this is this is group 2, and where's group 1?
No, that's group 1 here.
Okay.
And group 2 here with the averages.
Oh, good. This came out very nice. Okay. All right. So this is a fun one. Okay, so let's see. Here's what I asked you guys before the talk. You were divided into 2 isolated groups. You each read 2 questions. The second question was, how many countries are there in Africa? Now, why would one side, I guess I can tell you the answers. Group 1, you guys, your average guess was 49.72. Let's say 50. All right, 50. You guys, your average was 23. Now, why would this side of the room have a guess that's twice the size of the guess on this side of the room? Well, the reason is that our brains in estimation, remembering frequencies, probabilities, and sizes are very tenuous, okay, and very easily influenced. And this is another reason that you misjudge things, okay? And how did I get you to misjudge this? I did a very simple thing, right? This is the first question. The first question you got was different. You got one question, you got another question. I'm sorry, these are the results from a couple other groups I did. The first question was, the group that on this side that did 50 were asked, are there more than 180 countries in Africa? You guys were asked, are there more than 5 countries in Africa? Well, those answers are pretty obvious, but what it did was it planted a seed in your brain, and then when I asked you how many countries are there, it skewed your results, okay? And this is related to another effect called priming, which is also very amusing, where they've shown that if I say like rude, loud, and a whole bunch of words like that, you are more likely to go back and have an argument with your boss than if I didn't say that. But don't blame me, please. Well, I'll be out of here, I guess. So this is actually something that is used either consciously or unconsciously. People asking for things, okay, civil suits. You demand $100 million, $200 million. Well, you might not even think you're going to get that, right? You might not even expect to get that. But if you ask for $5 million, you're probably going to get a lot less than if you ask for $100 million to start with. Bail amounts, and there have been studies showing that the effect works in all these different areas. And even gamblers judge bets based on the payoff, not on the expectation of winning. In other words, not a balance of the payoff and the probability, but just the payoffs. So as some parting words, I have one of my favorite quotes from Bertrand Russell. He said, we all start from naive realism, i.e., the doctrine that things are what they seem. We think that grass is green, that stones are hard, and that snow is cold. But physics assures us that the greenness of grass, the hardness of stones, and the coldness of snow are not the greenness of grass, hardness, and coldness that we experience, that we know in our experience, but something very different. And what I hope to show in the book is that the mathematics of randomness is similar. And the mathematics shows you that the world that you perceive and that you interpret around you is not the world that you think that you see and that you conclude intuitively that you see, but it's really something very different if you take the time to analyze it. So it's as if the world around you, in your perception, is like a Van Gogh painting. It's vivid, it has sharp lines and contrasts, but in reality it's like a grayscale thing, kind of blurry, and underneath there might be very vivid potentialities, but by the time things happen, it's all blurred by the effects of randomness. And what are the implications of that? I'm not saying don't try hard, talent doesn't matter, ability doesn't matter. All those things matter, and it's important to increase your probabilities, okay? But if you fail, for instance, don't say I suck, you know. Don't say my manuscript sucks because it got rejected, say, by 10, publishers like Harry Potter did the first time. Or one manuscript was called Dreary, and a typical portrait of family bickering or something. That was the Diary of Anne Frank. So when these things happen, don't take it to heart. There's a lot of chance and luck involved. And on the other side, if you have great successes, don't consider yourself the person of destiny and think that you're better than everybody else, but that everything is kind of randomized and blurred by the effects of chance. And it doesn't mean also that you can't do something about it. There are many things you can do about it to increase your chances. As I say, you increase your chances if you're just plain increase your own ability. You also increase your chances by having a lot of at-bats. The more opportunities that you have, the more opportunities that you take, the greater the chances that you'll have a success. And so I want to end with one other quote, which is a little bit more succinct from someone also in the computer biz, Thomas Watson from IBM. And he said, if you want to succeed, double your failure rate. Thank you. Questions? Yeah.
I had a question about the Yale students. Suppose that a Yale student walked into that experiment with no preconceived notions about whether ESP worked or not. Then if he was a pure Bayesian, he'd see, my performance in this is similar to my performance in other skill-based tasks. Therefore, on the balance of probability, this must also be a skill-based task.
They got 15 out of 30 correct.
You said he did well at the beginning and worse at the end. And that's what I'd expect for all skill-based tasks, that I sort of tire after a bit. So
or maybe you learn it after a bit. I don't know, but overall, I don't know. I mean, I'm sorry. So what is your question?
If it's true that they were relating it to other tasks which had a similar profile, then the answers they gave would not be indication of a cognitive illusion. Instead, it would be an indication that they were being really good Bayesian inference people, that they were actually making the right call.
I wouldn't say that if they got 15 out of 30 correct, but if you say that they're getting tired or...
So the experiment to distinguish that would have been to see some of them doing this top-loaded 15 out of 30 correct versus others who had a different balance, maybe a more even balance.
Yeah, there may have been a condition where they did that. I don't really remember. But I think they were definitely going under the conclusion that, operating under the conclusion that if they got half of them right, then it wasn't skewed really. You could even argue that the fact that they're getting more wrong at the end would tend to leave a bad taste in their mouth and have them think they couldn't do it. But in the book, if you want to look it up, I mean, I have the reference to this study is in the footnotes.
So, given what you know about probability, do you live your life any differently than a normal person?
I definitely live my life differently than a normal person. I have changed, yeah. I think so. It certainly helps to have I have a certain Zen attitude, which I think has started when I wrote the book about Feynman, actually, around that time, Feynman's Rainbow. A certain way of looking at life, and this has definitely amplified that because a lot of times when things happen, I go, I'm drawing a conclusion from not very much data, or if something happens that's either very good or bad, you tend not to take it to heart as much because you realize that those things happen. But even, personally, if someone behaves in a certain way and you interpret that as being like rude or in some other negative light, because you have an expectation because of the person's reputation or for some other reason. And then you ask yourself, was that really rude behavior, or was that me just, interpreting it that way? So I definitely tend to look at things a little differently and realize that we often jump to conclusions, totally non-mathematical conclusions that really aren't justified based on one or two incidents, right? And it definitely, I say that to myself a lot, I learned not to do that,
You know the book Stumbling on Happiness?
Yeah.
I think you sort of alluded to it, I think, with the control experiment on older people. Do you buy the premise there that we have like zero ability to predict which outcome will make us happier?
I don't know if he said zero, but he said, Little.
That's the basic thesis.
Yeah. Yes, I do. I think that, well, for one thing, the studies he cites are very convincing, but I find the same thing in life, and I find that a comfort in a way, because you go, this really bad thing is happening, but you know what? With my son, something happened the other day, and I said, in 6 months, you won't even remember this. Your life will not have changed, because in that book, for instance, they talk about the lottery winner and the paraplegic, right? Someone is terribly injured, becomes a paraplegic, or a quadriplegic, I don't remember, and someone else wins the lottery, and they go to them a year later, and I don't know how they did this or how it happened, but they had some tests of happiness before and after, and they were equally happy. So happiness, I think, comes more from in here, and it's also hard to predict what circumstance that happens around you is going to make you happy or not. And if you look on the back of my book, there's a nice quote from Daniel Gilbert about Drunkard's Walk. So he seems to believe this book as well.
How do you find the lottery winner before they win?
I don't know. So, and I don't. That's why I said I don't know how they did. I don't know if they happened to be, maybe they happened to be studying that person had come in. I don't really know. I don't know if he says it in the book. I don't remember him saying how that happened. But
Which the paraplegic?
yeah, I don't know how they did. But I'm sure there's a reference to it. And when I read that book, sometimes I would go back to the original papers because I was curious about how it actually did it.
Well, I think they just look at lottery winners overall and compare their happiness with the happiness of the population of people that have something bad happen. And you expect that you'd see a gap, but you don't.
Oh, maybe, yeah.
Yeah, do you give any credibility to the power of the observer on scientific experimentation?
I'm sorry, could you say
Do you
again?
give any credibility to the power of the observer on scientific experimentation?
The power of the observer?
Yeah, the fact that you're just watching something that may be a random event. Do you have a viewpoint on that?
Well, one thing I have thought about is this effect, and especially in medical studies, where if you have a positive result, you report it. If you have a negative result, you bury it. And so if we have statistical significance, which means that 5% of the time you'll have a spurious positive result, but if you bury the other 19, then you have what looks like a good positive result. So I definitely think that there is that, and that effect of the experimenter. You have to be very careful that the experimenter is objective and is not analyzing the data in a way that reflects what they want to find. And that's why good experimenters have to design everything beforehand and not change the design later because they're seeing something happening, right? And that's why it's dangerous in medical studies also to go, we weren't looking for this effect, but guess we found a small effect of, right? Well, there's a million small effects that could happen with small probability by chance, and some of them are going to happen, and if you weren't looking for it and it suddenly is there, you have to be very suspicious about it. So I think that is a danger.
Can you say something about conditional probabilities?
Yeah, that's what the false positives test was. What do you want me to talk about?
Well, the subject intrigues me that the probabilities that are mathematically there could change with the context.
Okay, I have the problem. This is my book, but I didn't put this in because it's kind of a mind bender. But have you guys heard of the two-daughter problem? Okay, so this is a variant on the two-daughter problem. This is a good one for you to go back to your desk and waste the rest of the day. Suppose I have this room and you all have 2 kids. All right, so you all have 2 kids, right? So what if I know that like one of yours is a girl, but I don't know you that well? I don't know if you have 2 girls or 1 girl. What are the chances, given that knowledge, that you have 2 girls?
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, so I know that you have 2 kids. I know that you have one or 2 girls. What are the chances that you have 2 girls? Okay, well, this isn't the problem, so I'll just tell you. The chances are 1 in 3. Okay, because there's 4 possibilities. You could have you could have had a boy and then another boy. You could have had a boy and then a girl. You could have had a girl and then a boy. You could have had a girl and then another girl. Okay, those are all equally probable because boys and girls, assuming that they're equally probable. Okay.
If you have one boy, you're more likely to have another one.
I don't know. I haven't heard that, but let's just say, let's forget that part. And if that's true, I haven't heard that, but I do know that one is slightly more probable than the other, right? But forget that. They're 50-50. So if I eject the boy, because that's the information I know. So that's what changes. So initially, your chances of 2 girls are 1 in 4, but the knowledge that you have at least 1 girl makes that 1 in 3. Okay, that's not the problem. The problem is if you know the name of the girl, does that change anything? Yes, it does. See, that's the hard thing to get. So if I know that your girl is a girl named Florida, this is what I talk about in the book. So I remember that you're my distant cousin. I remember I know you have 2 kids. I know you have like a girl named Florida, but I just don't know if you have 2 girls or 1 girl. Is that different than I just know you have a girl, and I don't know if you have 2 or 1? It is different. But if you want to stay later, I could explain it, but I don't want to bore people here. But it's maybe something that's worth thinking about. You want to hear it? All right. Okay. So the same. Okay. Let's take the same. Let's take the same situation. Let's say that this room. Okay, and you all have 2. Okay. So what conditional probability about is taking into account new information, right? So suppose that there's 100 people in this room. And I don't want to get the numbers screwed up, but suppose it's a 1 in 100 name for girls, okay? So now I have to look at a lot of different categories of people. So there's not just boy, there's boy, there's girl named Florida boy, right? And there's girl not named Florida boy, 2 different categories, right? And then there's boy, girl named Florida. And then there's a boy, girl not named Florida, right? And then there's a girl named Florida, girl not named Florida. And there's a girl not named Florida, girl named Florida. And let's forget both being named Florida. I mean, it doesn't change much, and it's very rare, and who would do it? All right. So it may be hard to do without I should have done, there's a blackboard. But, okay, those all have different probabilities now, right? Because the girl named Florida is 1 in 100, or it's 1 in a million, I say in the book, but let's say it's 1 in 100, okay? And the girl not named Florida is, okay, it's 1 in 100 times the 1/2 because it's a girl. So the chances of not knowing what the kid is, the chances of a girl are 1/2, right? The chances of a girl named Florida are 1/2 times 1/100th, okay? It doesn't really matter, I call it epsilon. 1/2 times a small number, right? The chances of a girl not named Florida are 1/2 times almost 1, pretty close to 1, right? Okay. So now I'm going to take the new information. I'm going to send everybody away from this room except those who satisfy my new information. Okay? And my new information is not just that there's 1 girl, but there's a girl named Florida. So if I take out all those possibilities, what am I left with? Like the boy go away, right? The girl not Florida goes away, right? What stays? The boy, girl named Florida, the girl named Florida boy, the girl not Florida, girl Florida, and the girl Florida, girl not Florida. Those 4 possibilities, right? They all have equal probability because they all have 1 Florida in there, 1 boy and 1 girl. I mean, they have 1 Florida in there, right? And they all have equal otherwise possibility of 1/4. 2 of those are 2 girls. 2 of those are 1 girl families. So the chances are now 50-50, not 1 out of 3, which is why I had to convince you first that it was 1 out of 3 so I could get you back to be surprised about the 50-50. But if you do it as a function of epsilon, it interpolates between, so when everyone is named Florida, you find 1 out of 3 as a function of epsilon. So epsilon is 1, right? You'll find 1 out of 3. As epsilon gets smaller and smaller, the answer goes to the limit of epsilon being 0 to 1 out of 2. And if half the girls are named Florida, it's in between. But in reality, I did some research. I didn't put it in the book, but it's horrible. I'm very slow at writing books because I get into this and I go, what are the probabilities of names? In I think 16th century Scotland, 25% of the girls were named Mary. I still remember that. Not very useful, but then I found that I think Emily was the most popular name when I was looking this up, and it had an incidence of about 1%. So for the purpose of this problem, even a pretty common name is a rare name because it's just 1%. But Florida was an actual name that was given to people, given to girls up until about 1930. And it wasn't that uncommon. And there's actually a website. Okay, the U.S. government, blessed be them, take your money and they don't just spend it on, I won't even go there, but they also spend it on things like lists of names and their frequencies. I forgot, it might be in the book, in the footnotes, but there's a website that gives names by year and the frequency of those names. I'm not sure what they use it for, but they got it there.
I think it's just for general interest. It's generated off of Social Security records they have anyway.
Oh, they have it, yeah.
Somebody was bored, ran a big query, burned a lot of electricity doing it, but probably not too much time.
Okay.
So this suggests that accrual of information affects probability.
What do you want to answer that?
It only affects, it only, affects my probability of being right.
No, I got where I love you.
Yeah, this is the thing that can only affect your probability of being right if you basically make your predictions after you get the information. There's the other problem.
New information changes the probabilities.
Talk about new information. You're familiar with the problem with three doors?
Yeah, the Monty Hall problem.
One of the doors is prize blinded. You have to choose one, and then after
You know the Monty Hall problem?
That's the 1 in 3. It's the same as the 1 in 3. But need a 1 in 3.
So let's make a deal. Yeah, 3 doors, and you want to. And the thing is, so there's that problem. There's 3 doors, and at first you just pick a door. If it could have a prize, it could have not a prize. Then the host picks one of the 2 doors that you didn't pick and says, look, there's not a prize here. Do you want to change door? Should you, shouldn't you? Everyone says, it doesn't matter, but it matters. And the reason that mistake that people, I talk about this in the book too, not only I talk about the whole history of this, because this is a very interesting history, but the reason it matters is that the host is not acting randomly, right? The host is opening either door at random. If you pick the prize, then he can open either door. But if you didn't pick the prize, he's choosing to open a door, right, based on where the prize is. So he's adding information, he's changing it, so you shouldn't expect it to be random. And there's other ways of looking at it that make it pretty clear. But that's a problem that when Marilyn Vos Savant published it in a newspaper in Parade magazine, she got 10,000 letters about it, including about 1,000 from math PhDs, most of which said that she was full of it and she shouldn't mislead the American public. And I think the girl named Indiana problem is a little bit, named Florida problem. Could have been Indiana. I was going to name her Cinnamon at one point. That's also a rare name, but I didn't want people get confused with the Spice Girls. So.
The boy problem, I think, is a troublesome one. More troublesome than the Monte Carlo one, because or the Monte Carlo one, because you're just counting twins and all sorts of other things that I think.
Right, that's okay, because what we're saying is, here's our model. We're going to discount twins. We're going to assume boys and girls are equally probable. We're going to assume that parents would not name both kids Florida, but that they would, so that's just when you make a probability model, you
future child and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
I think it's a very, because it maps.
It's an idealized problem.
Yes.
But so is the Monty Hall problem, because how often do you go through life and someone says, here's these doors? Not since the show was canceled.
There's a game show that had particular rules, whereas children are different.
Yeah, but I can tell you how.
When you're listing the possible permutations of conditions of boy and girl, it implied that you believed that the birth order was significant when guessing if the other child was a boy or girl. Why is that?
Well,
why does it matter if it was boy or girl boy? If one of them's a girl.
Okay, imagine having 2 kids.
Boy, girl, if you ignore order.
I'm sorry? Well, you can't ignore the order, because if you take, what I'm saying is, if you take 1,000 people and you have them each have 2 kids, assuming that boys and girls are equally likely, there's no correlation between first child and second child, etc., each have 2 kids, how many do you think are going to have 1 boy and 1 girl? 1/3 of them, or 500, or 333?
But we're only talking about people that do have 2 children and that one of them is a girl.
Mm-hmm. But it could be the first one or the second, so there are 2 different possibilities. This is a problem that Galileo first solved, and this was in the he was asked by the Grand Duke of Tuscany, who was quite a gambler. See if I can remember the problem, but it was a dice problem, and this is in the book, but I don't quite remember it. But he was wondering why, when I think you were throwing 3 dice, why a certain number that could come up. Oh well, I don't quite remember it, so I'll just stop there. But it is a difference, because if you catalog, I mean, it doesn't matter that they're born. It's not the birth that matters. It's when you have 2 things. The first one could be something, or the second one could be something. Or that's different from the second one being something and the first one being something. Just, you know what? You can just mimic it with 2 dice, though. You could take dice and throw either even or odd dice, right? And you want to ask, what are the chances that they're both even or both odd? Okay? And the chances are that's exactly the same problem as the boy-girl problem, and because there's half a chance for each die, whether it's even or odd.
Wouldn't that reasoning apply talking to your cousin example? Is that you say, hey, my cousin, I know that your first child was a girl. Now let me think about any other.
No, that is 50-50. If I know your first child is a girl, that's why people get confused, because that's the difference.
The birth, one way of looking at it is the birth order only matters in determining what the priors are on the possibilities ignoring order. So you use the 2 independent events to get to the fact that the prior is 0.25 boy, 0.25 girl, and 0.5 boy-girl. So once you get to that point, then you don't need to think about birth order anymore. You just say, okay, I'm ruling out boy, so of what's left, it's 1/3.
You are Bayesians here, aren't you?
Yeah, we are, actually.
Okay. All right. If that makes it simpler. Okay.
Thank you.